everybody? Welcome back to the Som TV podcast. My name is Jason Wise. On today's pod, we are going to discuss the concept of dry January. Yes, we did it last year, but we're going to do a little spin on it this year. We're going to talk about dry wines, the misconceptions, the conceptions, and a lot of things, what it actually means. And on the podcast today, I have our podcast producer and winemaker, John Adams, and Claire Copey, who worked the floor as a sommelier for quite a long time and has a unique perspective on that topic, especially some of the misconceptions I think a lot of guests and maybe even the wine industry has about what that means. Before we do that, as always, I want to tell you, somtv.com, you can get Som TV for an entire year for $49.99. It exists on all platforms. So if you use your Apple TV, your Roku, your Amazon Fire Stick, your phone, on the web, whatever you want to do, you can watch it just like Netflix or Hulu or anything like that. Hundreds and hundreds of hours with lots more coming of educational and original shows. Go to somtv.com for $49.99 for an entire year to subscribe. It's great to have you two on the podcast. We are doing what we always do. We're going to talk about wine and talk about some of the things that people misunderstand about wine. Claire, how are you? John, how are you guys doing? Good?
Very good.
Very good.
Very good.
Very good.
Good. So let's start off with dry January. Are any of us practicing dry January? I wonder if any listeners actually followed through with this concept.
John?
I'm definitely not following dry January. I just continued drinking throughout all the months of the year. But I drink in moderation, so I don't really need to think about taking a whole month off. That's my approach.
Claire? Yeah,
that's the key, right?
John, you're a very sane person, though, so that makes sense coming from you.
Yeah, moderation's the key, right? I'm practicing what I call damp January.
Moist January?
It's moist at times, but can be dry at other times.
Okay.
So I was just because like by the end of the year, with all the holidays and everything, I was drinking a bit. There were lots of celebrations, lots of things, and I was just feeling gross. I just felt really gross. And I was like, I just need to make a change. But I still kind of stand by like what I said last year with dry January, like just going cold turkey like that. It's such an extreme thing. And then people just as soon as February starts, they start binge drinking again. And I wanted to bring balance back to my life. So I'm not drinking during the week. And on the weekends, I try and limit myself to 2 beverages. So again, just sanity.
Well, that's pretty good.
I try.
Yeah, I try not to drink during the week too.
Yeah.
I limit it to weekends, which is pretty good move. Because it gives you something to look forward to. You have a nice long week of work. Yeah. Friday rolls around. It's time to party, make a nice dinner.
Is Friday the weekend? That's something I've been
for me,
discussing.
Friday, Saturday.
Yeah, I think it is.
You can't just skip out on Friday night.
Right, because that's when the weekend starts.
Yeah, January you're not around so much family, so I think it's a lot easier to not drink. Not that my family doesn't make me drink. My family's wonderful. Huge support system.
You just have your 2 daughters just holding you back and pounding a bottle of wine down your throat.
Jason, what about you?
It's tough. I mean, for me, it's a combination of working on all of the things we do makes it tough to have a dry January. I mean, I see like Delin Proctor, who's in the Som films, he'll say on like Twitter, I have wine to sell. I can't participate in a dry situation. And I think it's similar for me. I mean, dry is not necessarily possible, but again, moderation, which I think is something that is a marathon and not a sprint. You're trying moderation in everything, not just alcohol.
It's good advice for life.
I think that we closed out the year on an episode on hangovers. So clearly, we have some personal work to do. All right, enough with that, because the dry January thing I think is good, but I always think that if you have to do that, you probably have a greater problem that has to be addressed. Is my always ever ending opinion.
Wow.
So, all right. So I want to talk about dry wines, and let's talk about kind of what this means from different perspectives. John, I want to start with you on the concept of just a straight up definition of what makes a wine dry. What does that mean?
A dry wine is a wine that has very little residual sugar. So when you ferment a wine, the yeast converts the sugar down to CO2 and alcohol. So when you let all the sugars disappear in the wine, when the yeast consumes all the sugar, that is technically a dry wine. The number is actually 4 grams per liter or less of sugar in solution.
And that is, and just to beat that down a little bit, that is the choice of the winemaker, correct? This is a situation where you can
Correct.
ferment something down to dry, and that's by the hand of the winemaker.
Definitely. Different styles of wine are going to have different amounts of residual sugar. Dry wines have very little sugar, but you could have any number of wines throughout the world that have plenty of residual sugar.
All right, so the big question is, what percentage of wines in the world are actually dry?
It's a good question. I would say the majority. I would definitely say greater than 50%.
I'm surprised. I would have thought it was like even higher. I would have thought it was
Well, it
much
probably
higher.
is higher.
It probably is higher, and that has a lot to do with preference too, right? Dry wines are what's pretty popular right now. Most people do not like sweeter wines. So I think, the production of dry wines is going to be higher just to meet that popularity and demand, right?
I mean, if I was to ask you, because I think the dry wine situation is probably one of the biggest misunderstood and maligned things. I mean, oftentimes at restaurants, you see somebody going, I would like something dry. I don't like sweet. I don't like sweet. The correlation between what that means is a taste thing, not necessarily a calorie thing. And I think that is a big misconception as well. What about let's just pull something out of our butts here. What about Napa Cab? Is that a dry wine, a traditional Napa Cabernet?
Yes.
What about a Malbec?
Yes.
All right. So if I go into a restaurant and I get almost any wine on a wine list, chances are I'm getting what would be classified as a dry wine. So less than that number of milligrams of sugar per liter.
Pretty much. Most of the time, it's very specifically noted that it's an off-dry wine or a dessert wine or a fortified wine that would indicate there is some measure of residual sugar or sweetness in the wine.
That would always be something too, like if a guest didn't know, like there's like an Auslese, which is a sweeter style of Riesling from Germany. If a guest didn't know that and ordered it, I would be like, oh, just so you know, this is a sweeter wine. So a lot of times, hopefully you have a guide there to help you differentiate as well, if it's not noted.
Are there any wines that are in the kind of vernacular commonplace that are off dry that people wouldn't know that you can think of off the top of your head? Because I mean, I think when people think of wines that are sweet, they're automatically going to dessert wines. They're thinking about port. They're thinking about things that are actually fortified. But are there any wines that are off dry that are common that you can think of?
Oh, yeah. Well, one that a lot of people might think is dry on a list is Vouvray. So they see it's Chenin Blanc. A lot of people assume Chenin Blanc is going to be dry. But in Vouvray, in the Loire Valley, it's typically made off dry. So you do have that residual sugar.
Interesting. There are also a lot of champagnes that I find that are slightly off dry, that are not
Extra brut.
that are not as dry as you'd think. And I think there are things that mask sugar really well, especially when you add carbonation. If a wine is carbonated, I truly do think that's one of the things that masks sugar. Now let's take the reverse. What is something that people think is sweet that they're really tasting? I think people will taste a wine and they think it's sweet when it's really not. I mean, from what this is going to sound wild, but I think the heavy usage of new oak, oftentimes people think is a sugar. They taste the spices, they taste kind of, and oak mellows a wine, so it allows certain things to come forward, sometimes the fruit.
Yeah.
And what that does, this is just my personal opinion, is it makes people think, oh, this is a sweet wine, when truthfully, it's just not. It is fermented dry. And I think that can be a misconception.
But I think it's important to understand the relationship between sugar and acid. I mean, it's like, sugar, acid, tannin, alcohol, fundamentals of wine. But the presence of sugar in a really acidic wine, it takes the edge off of that acidity and it balances things out. So for example, if you were to take going chemistry wise here, if you're looking at the pH, right, the acidity of something, if you take a lemon, which is pretty tart, right, it has a very low pH, 2.5-ish, and then you were to take Coca-Cola, which is very sweet, but surprisingly also has the same pH. So Coca-Cola and lemons have the same exact pH, but the difference is the sugar.
Dang.
So you can imagine what that does in a wine when you have high acid Riesling, and you leave a little bit of residual sugar, it takes the edge off of that acid and balances out into a delicious bevy.
Claire, when you were serving and working as a sommelier on the floor, what was the overall diner's perspective? Did you find anyone across the board that was like, I would like a sweet wine?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You definitely got guests that said, I want something with like a little kiss of sweetness, nothing like too crazy. I don't want a dessert wine. And then, as you were saying, there is that confusion sometimes with guests, the difference between something that is technically sweet and then maybe a technically dry wine that is fruit forward. Because I think there are some guests who want something that they perceive as truly dry, and then some of those bigger, more robust reds that are jammy come off as sweet to them. But yeah, I had a lot of guests that would want sweet wines. Not as many though as wanted the dry wines, for sure.
Yeah.
Dry is very popular.
So from a pairing standpoint, Claire, what's an application for sweet wine that's not, all right, I'm going to have it with dessert, and maybe not sweet but off dry? When you're talking about different food pairings, where does that tool come into the toolbox?
Yeah, sweetness is great to pair when you have spicier food. So that was a great tool when pairing at a place like Sushi Note where I worked at. And you have like fresh wasabi and a lot of these things, and then sometimes you get chili oil implemented, peppers, and it's great to then, especially in a pairing situation where you're allowed to be a little more adventurous, to give a guest an off-dry Riesling, a Vouvray, maybe a demi-sec sparkling, and give them that little bit of sugar, and they can see how that plays with the heat because it tones it down a little bit. And also seeing that a sweet wine doesn't have to be cloying, disgusting, syrupy, that it can still be fresh, because especially if you have a higher acid wine with residual sugar, they balance out so nicely. It keeps it lifted, it keeps it bright, it keeps it from becoming that super syrupy, disgusting thing that I think a lot of people think sweet wines are.
That's unfortunate. It really is, because
Yeah.
it also hurts the reputation of wines that are really well done, that are sweet. I mean, I think we were talking about moderation and balance earlier, but I mean, when it goes so deep into the winemaking thing of how you play with, things like, I don't know, acid and fruit and tannin versus a sweetness level. And that, I think, is, you don't have to be a sommelier. I think innately anybody who's drinking wine knows these things. They just don't know how to talk about it, which is fine. It's kind of like if you have a wine that has acid and sometimes can have quite a bit of sugar. I mean, Sauternes are a perfect example. Like a really well-made Sauterne, which would be, from Bordeaux, southern Bordeaux, is a region that oftentimes these wines have an incredible amount of acid. And so when you taste them and you drink them, if they're made properly and not made to be just a sugar bomb, they're very balanced in a way that is kind of, I mean, some of the top ones, I mean, Chateau d'Yquem is obviously an easy peg for this, but Reyes-Sec and all these other ones that are not quite as expensive, they fill your mouth with an acid that sort of washes the sugar away. And so what are some examples of wines, Claire, that you would recommend besides Vouvray that are sort of off dry that people should try to get into something with a little bit of sugar?
Well, you brought up slightly sweeter styles of champagne. I think that's a great way to get adventurous, to get in that extra brut style, which kicks up the sugar level a little bit. And because champagne is so high acid, for me, that wine doesn't even really come off as sweet. It just gives it a little more texture and a little more body. Because sometimes those brut and brut natures are lovely, but sometimes they can be a little too lean, especially, depending what you're eating. But I say, like, get adventurous with an extra brut. There are some fun pet nats out there, which are very popular now, that have a little bit of residual sugar on them that are fun. It just, again, it adds texture, it adds complexity, and they're not cloying. They're really fun. Those time and again when I was pairing and I gave a guest a wine with a little sweetness to it with the food, those were usually the favorite wines of the entire flight. And people were shocked that they loved the sweet wine.
So, I mean, I would like it if there was a way to start trying to convince consumers, because I really do think, I don't know if it's a caloric thing. People are thinking, I don't want the calories, because honestly, if you really look at calories in wine, this could be its own podcast. I mean, a 5-ounce glass of wine has on average about 123, 125 calories. So for the most part, even with the sugar, you're pretty much looking in that range. And that's kind of, I think, a misconception in wine. Like they sell skinny girl wine. And guess what? You're cutting out about 15 to 20 calories.
Yeah.
You're literally sacrificing, and I'm sorry to skinny wine, but you're sacrificing a lot of flavor. And it's just made for the gimmick of being low calorie. I wish there was a way we could convince the average, I drink wine, not as a profession. I drink wine as a, when I'm out to dinner or whatever, to try these new things. And so Vouvray, a sweeter champagne, I always go towards, Vinho Verde has a little bit of sugar in it, right? That's a tiny kiss. And also a very affordable bottle. I wish there was a way that we could convince people to try some of these wines. And January's not over. So if you're not drinking, I would say let's go the opposite direction and give one of these wines a chance. Now, on the dessert wine front, or what's typically classified as a dessert wine, one of the big misconceptions, and Claire, you and I are always on this horse about sherry. I just want to plug sherry, which is one of the most underrated human creations that you can drink. Most of sherry, 90% of it, is so dry. Bone dry.
Well,
Fino sherry, Amontillados, all of these things are generally very, 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 very dry. So let's say that a lot of the things that are classified as dessert wines or after dinner drinks or whatever, they're not all completely sweet at all in any way, shape, or form. Let's do a couple minutes really fast, Claire, on these quote unquote dessert wines. And what are some of your favorites?
Ooh, I always love Madeira. Madeira's, I love the sherries as well, but I just love a little glass of Cercial Madeira. And that is the driest style of Madeira. And it is nutty. It is got the citrus skin. It's the walnuts. It's got mushroomy quality to it as well. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. And I love to have it on its own. I love to have it with food. It's completely underrated. And I also love with Madeira, because of the way that it's made, once you open that bottle, it's fine. It's good to go. You can leave it sitting on your countertop for years and it stays perfect and beautiful and lovely. So you don't have the panic of...
I know some people that would be mad at you for that because they say Madeira, you only get about a 2.5-3 week window with it open. I've heard it. I will also say that Madeira is definitely pretty goddamn bulletproof when it comes to being a wine that you can drink. What's the application for Madeira?
Any application you want. It's great with dessert, honestly, even though it doesn't have any sweetness. But I'm especially thinking like the creme brulee because it's got that that caramel shell on the top. And the Cercial Madeira I once heard described by another sommelier that it's like salted caramel without the sugar, which I thought was so spot on and brilliant. So you can have it with dessert, great with a charcuterie board if you're having a little charcuterie night with your friends. Going to be great with those meats and some of the aged cheeses. It'd be great with the blue cheese. It'd be great with, aged harder cheeses as well. Honestly, all cheeses. It'd be just delightful. It'd be great with dried fruits. You could have that with a ham dish as well. You could pair that with dinner. There's so many applications for Madeira.
It's really good with salt.
It's insane.
Really good with salt. I had a Madeira, a really dry Madeira with you ever have those chocolate chip cookies that have salt in them, like sea salt chocolate chip cookies?
Oh, yeah.
I'm telling you,
great.
A really good sea salt chocolate chip cookie with Madeira is, it's a sexual experience. It is an incredible situation.
Sexual.
Yeah, it really is, honestly.
It's pretty amazing. Pecan pie, too.
Yeah. Any of these things, when you're talking about a real fortified wine, I think some sherries enter this conversation, too, and you have them with the right food. A lot of people are like, they'll steer you towards, all right, a red wine and a steak or something like that. And I really don't think the pairing is anywhere near as good as one of these wines with what we're talking about. If you really want to understand food and wine pairing, I really do think the best way to do it is to have a Madeira or a true Marsala wine, which is a similar-ish type of a style of a wine, but it has to be real because Marsala you get for cooking is not
it.
Same with sherry.
It's yeah, and the same with sherry. These three wines that we're talking about, Marsala, sherry, and Madeira, there are certain levels, and a lot of the ones you find in the grocery store are often made for cooking, and they're not even from the region that they claim to be from. They're like a California sherry, or there's something for cooking. If you can get the real stuff and you can have it with any of these things we're talking about, a chocolate chip cookie, an oatmeal cookie, pecan pie, salty anything. One of the greatest pairings I can name, just to be on a little tangent for half a second, is green olives with Fino sherry. Green olives with Fino sherry is mind-bogglingly good. It's I think southern Spain runs on that and naps. And so it's really a tremendous it's really a tremendous thing. I think that's how they survived the Francisco Franco regime, was drinking sherry and eating green olives.
When you compare sherry versus port or other, dessert wines, from a winemaking perspective, is like sherry is dry fortified, so they let the fermentation finish, then they add the distilled spirit like brandy, and then port, the brandy is added sort of mid-ferment to preserve whatever amount of residual sugar you want left in the wine. Because the interesting thing with winemaking yeast, so the main yeast that ferments wine is called Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and there's a bunch of different types of Saccharomyces, but they're only good as far as their ability to ferment up to about 17, 18% alcohol by volume, and then they will start to die off because they can't function in a higher alcohol environment. So you get wines like Sauterne, for example. Those wines, the yeast goes through the fermentation as far as it can, and then it just sort of dies, and the residual sugar left over in that fermentation is the sweetness that you get on a Sauterne.
Yeah, and obviously you have a few other elements that go into a Sauterne. I mean, the grape itself is attacked by botrytis, which is a noble rot, which is a fungus, and it looks pretty grimy on the grape, but what it does is it does this incredible thing with the sugar. It sort of takes over the grape's essence, and that's the fun part about all of this, is all of those little pieces that create these wines oxidizing from Madeira and allowing the wine to actually reach, I mean, in some cases, they heat the wine, they leave it in the sun, they do things to beat it up. This stuff, if people don't drink and try these wines, these incredible centuries-old techniques are going to go away. As much as I love the explosion of Pinot Noir and all of these other things, which are dry wines, by the way, I'm a huge advocate for wanting people to understand where the concept of true dry wine, I don't know if started, but all of the regular table wines that we drink 150 years ago were very sweet. That is just a fact. Yeah, a fact across the board. And this stuff ebbs and flows as far as people's tastes go, but a lot of Bordeaux wines and clarets and all of these things that we think of and take for granted were a completely different wine 200 years ago. And even in some cases, 80 years ago. I mean, Barolo, which is made in various different styles, but can be a very tannic and very, you need to age it, very dry. That was a very sweet wine as soon as 75 years ago. I mean, a very sweet wine. In fact, they would ferment it as far as they possibly could to get it, to get the sweetness out of it. But it balanced because Nebbiolo is a very tannic wine. So again, we spoke at the top of this about moderation, balance, and that is something that as a winemaker, I think you're trying to reach within this glass. So final thoughts, I suppose, on this is, if you're practicing dry January, that's great. It's about to be over and Valentine's Day is coming and you're probably looking for a glass of wine. I would tell you, get something old school dry, get a Madeira, get a sherry. If you can find a great Marsala, none of these are very expensive, by the way. A Fino sherry will set you back probably $14 to $17 for a bottle, maybe.
Yeah.
You can get a bottle of good Madeira definitely in that same price range. I mean, some of these can go up higher, but you can get them in a very, very affordable. Get some green olives, get some salted chocolate chip cookies, have a great night. That's what I would say. Any final thoughts on dry wines or dry January?
Well, good luck finishing off dry January if you have gone completely dry or if you've gone damp like me. Let's keep being damp together throughout the year.
Oh my God. Damn. Oh boy, it's so good to have you guys on. I love talking wine. All right, everybody, don't forget to go to somtv.com and subscribe. $49.99 for an entire year with hundreds and hundreds of shows, hours of educational and entertainment. There's nothing else like SomTV. SomTV.com for anybody in your life that loves wine and great stories. All right, everybody, be safe. I'm going to go get myself a salted chocolate chip cookie, and I'm going to have it with Madeira. Goodbye, all.